Okay, welcome back everyone to our discussion of the weekly Haftara. Now this week, I think it's Haftara that everybody knows, sort of vaguely, Devorah, from the beginning of Sefer Shoftim. It's a Haftara that's popular. It is the longest Haftara ever. There is no Haftara that's longer than what we read this Shabbos, and it's fascinating to talk about. Right now, to talk about the connection between Shirat Hayam and Shirat Devorah is a waste of time. Obviously, the praise that Bnei Yisrael had for Kriyas Yamsuf is similar and justifies the choice of the praise that Devorah has for the miracle that God wrought in the conquering of Sisera and Yavin, etc. That's obvious. Much like as it happens, the Haftara for Shvi Shel Pesach, on which we also read Kriyas Yamsuf, is Shirat David. Okay, the Haftara for Parshas Beshalach is Shirat Devorah, and the miracle of God, drowning Pharaoh's army is very similar to the miracle of the flash flood, as we'll discuss, that happened at Nachal Kishon, that wiped out Sisera's army. Okay, now Devorah, being a woman, which we'll discuss also, it recalls in our parsha Miriam, Vatikach Miriam atop v'yadav v'tetzela achariah b'tukim v'imcholot v'atan la Miriam shir l'Hashem ki galga. Okay, Miriam did it, Devorah did it. But it's worth pointing out, at least at the outset, that there are two different minhagim about this week's Haftara. They're not conflicting minhagim, but they're different, right? Sfardim read Shirat Devorah, but they only read Shirat Devorah. Right, Ashkenazim, our minhag, is to read the story beforehand, the story that tells us, that helps us understand Shirat Devorah. Otherwise, it'd be really difficult for us to figure out what's going on in the Haftara. Okay, but the truth is that even for us Ashkenazim, who have the introduction of the narrative portion of Perek Daled, the truth is the Haftara doesn't start early enough. And it's possible that Chazal were aware of how long the Haftara is, and therefore didn't want to overburden us. But without the three psukim that begin Perek Daled of Sefer Shoftim, we'd really be lost. And the psukim go as follows. Vayosifu b'nei Yisrael asot hara b'nei Adonai ve'ehud meis. Right? The previous shofet, Ehud, passes away, and b'nei Yisrael are evil. Vayimkerem Adonai biyad Yavin melech Kinaan asher malach bechatzor v'sar tzvaos Sisera v'uyoshev b'charoshet hagoyim. And God gave us over to Yavin, the melech of Canaan, and he was the ruler of Chatzor, and his chief of staff, his main general, was Sisera. Last pasuk, Vayitzaku b'nei Yisrael al Adonai Ki tisha me'od rechav barzel lo, v'hu lachatzet b'nei Yisrael b'chazka 20 shana. And b'nei Yisrael cry out to God, much like they cried out to God in Mitzrayim. Why? Because Sisera has 900 chariots of barzel, of copper, of iron. It's an enormous number, and iron chariots are really, really strong. They're like tanks, right? V'hu lachatz et b'nei Yisrael b'chazka 20 shana. That's a phrase that doesn't come up very often, certainly not in Sefer Shoftim. He pressured, he ruled, he forced us into things for 20 years. Okay, it's not 400 years or 210 years like Mitzrayim, but it's enough time for Bnei Yisrael to cry out to God. Okay, now, if we didn't know this, we'd know somehow that Yavin is a bad guy and that Sisera is a bad guy, but now we know exactly what it is. By reading the first three psukim, we understand what the evil is that Bnei Yisrael was struggling against, and what the pressure is that they were struggling against. And then we come to Devorah. Okay, a woman named Devorah, and she's a Neviah. Now, for a woman to be a Neviah doesn't really raise any issues for us. Miriam HaNeviah. And certainly the Medrashim talk about, Sarah and Leah and Rachel and Rivka as being Neviot, and we love them very, very much, and we respect them. So the fact that a woman had prophecy doesn't raise any issues for us. But the fact that a woman had a position of public political power, that she was a shofet or a shofetet, that does raise certain issues for us. And certainly from the Gemara, the sense you get, and let's be clear, the Gemara was written well after the story of our Haftara. So it's not really a question on the Gemara. The Gemara is a question, our Haftara is a question on the Gemara. But the sense you get is that Chazal didn't want, and there was some minor problem with the woman taking on a role of political leadership and public political leadership. So it's interesting to note, Tosfos raises, in two different Tosfos raises three possibilities for how it is that despite the Gemara, Devorah was actually a shofetet. So the first idea was, it was a Harad Shah. Generally speaking, women are not supposed to be, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu allowed Devorah to be a shofet. It was necessary for the time, and he did it. Okay, that's one answer. It doesn't really move the needle one way or the other. Second, she was not technically a shofet. She was much more of a teacher to Bnei Yisrael. She taught them the Dinei HaTorah, and she led them in the direction that they should go in, like any great teacher. But she wasn't technically a shofet. Right now, the problem with that is the pasuk says, "The shofta et Yisrael ba'et hahi," she was a shofet. So you have to understand in this answer of Tosfos that it's not to be understood literally. She was a leader of Bnei Yisrael, for sure, as many women were over time, but she wasn't a shofetet. She wasn't actually the judge. Third answer of Tosfos is that, no, Bnei Yisrael accepted her as a judge. They saw that the Shekhinah was with her. They saw they could rely on her. They saw that God spoke through her. So they themselves made a decision to accept her as a judge, and that's slightly different than just appointing her, willy-nilly out of nothing. Okay? But we're not really going to discuss, the purpose of this shir is not to discuss the role of women. That's a fascinating topic, but thank God it's not our issue for today. Okay? Either way, Devorah functioned as a shofetet. Okay? Now, let's turn from Devorah to Barak. Barak, would have been the hero of the story, but what? So let's look. So Bnei Yisrael were being persecuted by Sisera and by Yavin and by Sisera, and Devorah gets the word from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's a prophecy. It's a nevuah. Devorah gets the word. Now is the time to rebel. God will support us in our rebellion against Sisera, and victory is guaranteed. Okay, now, what's the plan? So the plan seems to be, if you put it all together from after the fact, that Barak is going to go up to the top of Har Tavor with 10,000 men. Now, that doesn't seem, as a person who's been to the top of Har Tavor, it doesn't seem like a smart move militarily. It's not just, generally you think, okay, the elevated ground gives you an advantage militarily, but in this case, Har Tavor is very steep. But anyway, that's the idea. Barak goes up to the top of Har Tavor, and naturally, he draws the army of Sisera with their 900 chariots of iron to Nachal Kishon. Nachal Kishon is at the foot of Har Tavor. So, if your enemy is on Har Tavor and you want to fight them, you come to the bottom of Har Tavor. That's Nachal Kishon. Okay? Now, God is going to bring a flash flood to Nachal Kishon, which is going to damage and or destroy Sisera's army. That's the plan. Now, Devorah tells Barak that's what you should do, but Barak answers a very ambiguous answer. Says Barak, Vayoma eleha Barak, im telchi imi v'halachti, v'im no telchi imi lo elech. Barak says, okay, I'll do it, but I'll do it on the condition that you come with me. Meaning Barak is not completely confident in the nevuah, perhaps. He's not completely confident that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to be with him, but he thinks if the neviah comes with him, if the neviah is there, and she tells him exactly what to do, then it's all going to work out. Now Devorah responds to Barak, and she also gives kind of an ambiguous answer. Says Devorah, Vatomer, Haloch elechimach, I'll go with you. Efes, ki lo tiyeh tifartecha al haderech asher ata holech, but your glory won't be as great as it would have otherwise been. Ki biyad isha yimko Hashem et Sisera. Because God is going to give Sisera over to a woman. V'atokam Devorah batelech ba kedsha. And then she goes with him. So the general response of Parshanim to Barak is that it's a failure of Barak. It's a failure of his amunah. It's a failure of his self-confidence, right? If he had gone by himself, all the glory would have been his. He didn't go by himself, so he didn't get all the glory. But I don't see why that's the case. I don't see why this is such a negative for Barak. Devorah says to him, listen, I'll go with you, and the miracle will happen, but you won't get credit. Why don't we think that's so great that Barak said, you know what? I'm willing to do it without getting credit. V'kachava, by the way, Barak is the only, according to Rav Maidan at least, Barak is the only military leader in all of Sefer Shoftim who then doesn't take over the job, right? Usually, you win a battle, you become the shofet, vatishkot haaretz 40 shana. That's the cycle of Sefer Shoftim, right? Barak is the only person who doesn't get the job because he doesn't get the credit. But why not celebrate that approach? I'm not sure. I don't know why everybody's so sure that it's a failure of Barak. I think otherwise, but that's all right. Now, when Devorah says Ki biyad isha yimka Hashem et Sisera, at that point in the story, it's obvious that the biyad isha is Devorah herself, right? I wasn't going to go with you. If you make me go with you, I'm going to get credit for the victory and not you. Right? That seems obvious. But that's not how the story plays out, and we'll see that in a minute. But first, back to the story. Right? Barak takes 10,000 men to the top of Har Tavor, and Sisera comes to Nachal Kishon. And then, what a wonderful, beautiful religious moment. Vatomer Devorah el Barak, Kum ki zeh hayom asher natan Adonai et Sisera biyadecha. Halo Adonai yotzol lefanecha, vayed Barak mehar Tavor v'aseret alfim ish acharav. Right? Barak is on Har Tavor. It's the moment we pray for, and it's the moment he's afraid of. But since Devorah is with him, Devorah says to him, now is the time. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, now is the time. Bring the miracle. Vayaham Adonai et Sisera ve'et kol harecha ve'et kol hamachaneh lefi cherev lifnei Barak vayered Sisera me'ala me'arkava vayonas beraglav. And Vayaham. The word Vayaham should be familiar to us because it comes up in this week's parsha, right? First of all, we have a Masorah that tells us that what God did was bring a flash flood, as happens even this week. It happens often in rains in Israel. Bring a flash flood to Nachal Kishon, Vayaham, and it trapped, it ruined, it confused the army, right? What do we say in this week's parsha? Vahi bashmar haboker, vayashkef Adonai al machane Mitzrayim b'mun eish v'anan, vayaham eit machane Mitzrayim. He disrupted, he confused, right? There was a whole balagan. It's not just a linguistic parallel, it's a substantive parallel. The exact same miracle that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did in Mitzrayim to Paro on Yam Suf, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is doing now to Sisera, right? And this reading of the Pasuk is also supported by the Shira, right? We have a concept in Chazal that Divrei Torah ashirim b'makom echad va'aniyim b'makom acher, or aniyim b'makom echad va'ashirim b'makom acher. And it's so true when you're talking about the narrative portion versus the Shira of Devorah. The narrative portion doesn't say anything about a flood, but the Shira says, Min shamayim nilchamu hakochavim mimisilatam nilchamu im Sisera. There were shooting stars, there were all kinds of miraculous events happening in the Shamayim. And Nachal Kishon girafam, Nachal kidumim, Nachal Kishon tidrichin abshios. Right? Literally, they were swept away by the river, by Nachal Kishon, just like the Egyptians were swept away in Kriyas Yamsuf. Okay, now, what happened in the story? Uvarak radaf acharei harechav va'acharei hamachaneh ad charoshet hagoyim, vayipol kol machane Sisera lefi charav lo nishar echad. Right? When Barak totally decimates Sisera's army, lo nishar ad echad. It's hard not to notice that phrase, lo nishar ad echad, again, because it refers back to Kriyas Yamsuf in our parsha. Vayashuvu hamayim, vayichasu et harechav et haparashim l'chol chel paro, haboim acharhem bayam, lo nishar bahem ad echad. Right? It's not a phrase that comes up that often in the Torah. And now we know what the point is. Right? Lo nishar ad echad in Yamsuf, just like lo nishar ad echad in the story of Sisera. The ad echad in Yamsuf could be Paro, so the Paro could proclaim God's greatness. The ad echad in our story, in our Haftara, could be Sisera, but it doesn't exactly work because Sisera is about to meet his own end. And now we come back to the issue we raised earlier. What does the Neviah mean when she says, Ki biyadi isha yimkor Hashem et Sisera? So it turns out there's a whole end to the story. Says the Navi, V'Sisera nas beraglav elo el Yael eshet chever hakeni, ki shalom bein Yavin melech Hatzor bein beit chever hakeni. Right, Sisera runs away to the house of Yael, who's married to chever hakeni, because chever hakeni either had an official peace treaty or some kind of relationship with Sisera, and he thought he could trust her. Vateitze Yael likrat Sisera vatomar lov Sura Adoni Sura Elai Al Tira Vayasa Eleha Ohala Vatechaseu Basimicha. Right? She says to Sisera, come into my house, you don't have anything to worry about, and she covers him with a blanket. Vayomela Hashkini Namad Maim Kitsameti. He says, I'm thirsty, Vatiftachet Norachala Vatashkeo Vatchaseu. She doesn't just give him milk, she doesn't just give him water, she gives him milk, right, which also helps him to fall asleep, and she covers him again. Vayoma eleha amod petach haoel vayim ish yavo ushelech v'amar hayesh bo ish v'amar tayin. Right, stand outside the tent. If anybody comes looking for me, tell them there's nobody inside. Last part we're going to read. Vatikach Yael eshet chever et yitad haohel vatosem et hamakevet biyada vatavo elov balat vatitkat hayated barakato vatitznach ba'aretz v'hu nirdam vaya'af vayamot. And then Yael takes the tent pole, right, and she sneaks in quietly while he's sleeping, and she puts it through his head so that the tent pole is in the ground, right? She kills him, in a scary, scary way. Okay, now, the first thing which I assume most of the Parshanim agree on is that this is what Yael was referring to. I'm sorry, this is what Devorah was referring to when she said, Ki biyadi shayim kol Hashem et Sisera. Literally, Sisera is going to be killed by a woman, which is, without taking a stand on these things, which is considered embarrassing in Tanakh, right? But before that, you have to ask yourself, wait, if Yael's husband, Chever HaKeni, had some kind of peace treaty with Sisera, so morally, was it justified for Yael to kill Sisera? Right? To say to him, oh, you can trust me, come into my house, I'll take care of you. He goes to sleep, and she kills him? So here too, we need to look to the Shira for an explanation. And the Shira really gives a lot of time and a lot of space and a lot of emphasis to the Yael's role in the war. And the Shira has an interesting pasuk. Bein raglel kara nafal shachav, bein raglel kara nafal, va'asher kara sham nafal shadud. Right? The pasuk sounds like, if you're familiar with the other pasukim in Tanakh, it sounds like there's something sexual going on. Bein raglel kara, right? He bowed down between her legs. Shachav. Okay. So it turns out this is a Gemara on Chaf Gimel on Bet in Nazir. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan, Sheva bi'ilot ba'al oto rasha ba'ota sha'a. Right? Sisera raped Yael 7 times during that time. Shenemar, bein raglel kara nafal shachav. That's what the pasuk means. says the Gemara Nazir. So why did Yael do it? Obviously, for revenge, right? When Sisera finally fell asleep, and you can understand how tired he was, having fought a war and then done what he did to Yael, so she took revenge on him. And that's a pshat, and I understand that. But the opposite approach is the Medrash. The Medrash says, Amar Reish Lakish, Chizarnu al kol hamikra, where we've gone through all of Tanakh, v'lo matzinu kli sheshmo simicha. Right? We understand smicha as a blanket. But says Reish Lakish, it doesn't say it any place in Tanakh. Umau smicha, with a sin, by the way. So says the Medrash, Shakatuv Shmi Ka. Shmi, my name, Me'id Aleha, Shelo Nagaba Uto Rasha. There was no rape, there was no sexual relations between Yael and Sisera. Never happened. So then why, if the Medrash says this, right? If HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself is testifying that nothing happened between them, so why did she do what she did? And this brings us back full circle to the whole question of rebellion and to the deeper question, which we don't have time to discuss today, which is which Shvatim of Bnei Yisrael participated in the rebellion against Yavin and which didn't. Certainly the northern tribes did. They were the people who were most affected by it, right? But Yael's role is, when you get through it all, it's the Shem Shamayim, right? Yael looked at what was happening. She looked at what was true in the world and what was righteous in the world. And she said, I'm throwing my lot in with Am Yisrael. I'm throwing my lot in with the rebellion against Yavin, with the rebellion against Sisera. I'm not just throwing my lot in, I'm going to kill the figurehead. I'm going to kill the leader of the people who are enslaving the Jewish people. Right? Ki'ilu, I'm going to kill Paro Melech Mitzrayim. That's the parallel. And it makes the meaning of the Haftarah so much more meaningful that's out there. And we haven't really scratched the surface yet, and we're not going to, of Shirat Devorah. There's fantastic psukim in there, and there's a lot of good things to say. But I really think it's enough for today, other than to point out the obvious, which is once again we find that our understanding of the Haftarah is enriched by and helped by its parallels to the weekly parsha, and our understanding of the parsha is strengthened, and the key points are emphasized by a review of the Haftarah. And once again, it turns out that each helps the other. And I feel like my understanding of Beshalach and my understanding of Kriyas Hayam and Shiras Hayam is much more deep and much more strengthened because I now understand better the story of Devorah and the story of Shirat Devorah. That's enough for today. Yashkach to everybody, and Shabbat Shalom.